All right.
In 1971, a military analyst by the name of Daniel Ellsberg leaked to the press a 7,000-page top-secret Pentagon study uncovering
the whole notion of logic.
These are the journalisms by way of aggregation, illuminated from the analytical research of a historiographer, neither from the Oriental nor the Occidental. Your engagement through a like, a share, and a subscribe will accelerate us at warp speed towards the continuation of our mission to truthfully go where no news will have been going before.
Engage impulse engines. Engage. Engage.
Engage.
Engage. Engage. Engage. Engage.
Engage.
Engage. Engage. Engage. Engage. Engage. Engage.
Captain.
Engage emergency override.
Engage. Engage. Engage.
Engage forward shields, 35%.
Engage.
Engage the cloaking device.
Engage.
Of them. Engage them in conversation.
Engage. Engage.
Palestine Ibrahimi Mosque Massacre observers attacked. Watch this space. Israeli army attacks Palestinians commemorating Ibrahimi Mosque Massacre anniversary. Israeli forces violently attacked a crowd of Palestinians marking the 29th anniversary of the Ibrahimi Mosque Massacre on Friday. The official Palestinian news agency Wafa reported. Dozens of Palestinians were injured across different parts of the occupied West Bank, particularly in Hebron al-Khalil, the site of the 1994 atrocity, according to Wafa. Israeli soldiers cracked down on the rally in al-Khalil by throwing gas canisters and grenades and firing live ammunition in a bid to break up the demonstrations. In a statement, the Palestinian Ministry of Health said that its crews dealt with 3 injuries, 2 of which were due to stun grenades, while the other was a result of being hit with rubber-coated metal bullets. The Ibrahimi Mosque Massacre was carried out on February 25, 1994, by Israeli-American extremist and far-right Koch Party member Benjamin Baruch Goldstein. Goldstein opened fire on Muslim worshippers at the mosque, killing 29 people. A further 125 people were also wounded in the attack. The mosque, located in the old city of Hebron, is the second holiest site in Palestine. Palestinians in Hebron are subjected to discrimination by occupying Israeli forces, including through bans on entering certain streets, including the famed Al-Shahuda Street, where many Palestinians had businesses. Palestinian survivors of the Ibrahimi Mosque Massacre remember the horror. This is from Jacobin.com. 29 years ago, Benjamin Goldstein, a U.S.-born Jewish settler, shot and killed 29 Palestinians in Al-Khalil's Ibrahimi Mosque. Jacobin talked to witnesses who now face a rise in the same extremist Zionism that motivated Goldstein's slaughter. 29 years ago, on February 25, 1994, Benjamin Goldstein, a U.S.-born Jewish settler and member of the far-right Koch movement, entered the Ibrahimi Mosque in the old city of the southern occupied West Bank district of Hebron. It was during the Muslim holy month of Ramadan, and hundreds of Palestinians were crammed inside when they bowed in prayer. Goldstein, dressed in his Israeli army uniform, unshouldered an assault rifle and began shooting indiscriminately. 29 Palestinians, some of whom were as young as 12, were shot and killed while offering Fajr, the Muslim dawn prayer. At least 125 other Palestinians were injured. The entire mosque was turned into a pool of blood, remembers 47-year-old Mamoun Wazwaz, a survivor who was 18 at the time of the massacre. I was walking among the martyrs and injured. People were screaming. I was speechless. It felt like I was in a nightmare. The Israeli government has long claimed that Goldstein had acted alone and was psychologically disturbed. However, Palestinians believe that the massacre was a planned attack of which the Israeli military was aware in advance. Witnesses have also claimed that there was more than one shooter. It has continued to affect all of us here in Hebron or Khalil. Wazwaz continues, seated on the red carpet of the Ibrahimi Mosque, intermittently glancing at his young daughter playing in the corner. I still cry like a child when I remember. It's had an endless impact on us. We've never healed from what we witnessed on that day. Otzma Yehudit. Nearly 3 decades after the tragic day, life for Palestinians in Al-Khalil's old city has only deteriorated further, with Israel's labyrinth of military checkpoints and restricted roads suffocating the city's residents. Jewish settlers, meanwhile, strut confidently down the city's narrow streets, winding between centuries-old stone buildings. Most are strapped with pistols or machine guns. Israeli soldiers with gun barrels always hanging past their knees keep a watchful eye on Palestinians. Increasing the future seems yet to be even more dismal as the radical Zionist ideology of the late U.S.-born Rabbi Meir Kahane, which inspired Goldstein's attack on the Ibrahimi Mosque, has found a new home in Israel's mainstream. Israel's national elections this last November saw this once obscure, deplorable ideology, infamous for its extreme anti-Palestinian sentiments, enter into some of the highest echelons of Israel politics, following nearly 4 years of political deadlock and 5 elections. Otzma Yehudit, or Jewish Power, the far-right party led by Itamar Ben-Gvir, signed a coalition agreement with Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's Likud party and its allies, leading to a major seat when in the Israeli parliament, or Knesset. Ben-Gvir was Kahane's supporter in his youth and later attempted to moderate and popularize Kahane's messages. Jewish Power is considered in the ideological descent of the Chak Party, which was founded by Kahane in 1971 and banned in Israel after its members expressed support for the Ibrahimi Mosque mass shooting. With Jewish Power support, Netanyahu, who is on trial for corruption, has formed what observers have called the most right-wing parliament in the country's history. Ben-Gvir, a resident of Kiryat Arba, the same Al-Khalil settlement where Goldstein resided, and who was known to have a portrait of Goldstein hanging up on his living room, was named National Security Minister in the new government. In Al-Khalil's old city, where survivors of the massacre are still haunted by what they witnessed decades ago, the rise of Kahane's radical ideologies and their entrance into the mainstream had stoked fear. Our relationship with the settlers is even worse now than it was back then, Waz says, his eyes scanning the mosque walls, which are still riddled with bullet holes. What's stopping them from doing this again to us now that these same settlers are controlling the Israeli government? Yet not only that about Ben-Gvir, Itamar Ben-Gvir, the intro to our Yahoo segment features him dressed up as Benjamin Goldstein. Let's take a quick look at that.
Yahoo! Yahoo!
Yeah, so that's a young Itamar Ben-Gvir dressed up as Benjamin Goldstein, the terrorist who committed the Ibrahimi Mosque Massacre. The Ibrahimi Mosque, located in the heart of Al-Khalil's old city and known to Jews as the Cave of Machpelah, is sacred to both Muslims and Jews. The cave which the mosque was built over is believed to contain the tombs of the Prophet Abraham, or Ibrahim in Arabic, and his wife Sarah, along with their children Isaac and Jacob. On Thursday evening, the night before the massacre, confrontations broke out between Palestinians and Jewish Israelis around the mosque as a result of Ramadan and the Jewish holidays of Purim overlapping that year. It was Purim Eve, and large crowds of Jews attempted to enter the Ibrahimi Mosque at the same time that Muslims were supposed to pray Tarawih and congregational prayers performed during Ramadan. However, there was no serious violence that night. The next morning, however, on February 25th, as Palestinians crowded into the Ibrahimi Mosque for Fajr, a series of unusual events occurred. Israeli authorities, who even at the time controlled the Ibrahimi Mosque, gave an order that all women worshippers be moved to another area of the mosque. Usually women and men would pray in 2 adjoining rooms, with men in the main front section and women in the back. But for the first time in the history of the mosque, the women were all transferred to an entirely different area, says 71-year-old survivor Husni Hussein al-Rajabi. Israeli authorities had claimed this decision was due to overcrowding in the main area of the mosque. Palestinians believe it to be the result of much more nefarious intentions. Rajabi remembers feeling a tinge of unease when he entered the mosque about 30 minutes before the mass shooting occurred. One of the Jewish settlers, a Russian, was standing by the mosque's main entrance and welcoming worshippers, recounts Rajabi, who was accompanied by his wife and 6 children. He said, Bivakasha, a Hebrew word meaning please, go ahead, or you're welcome. To Palestinians when we entered, we'd never witnessed settlers behave like that before. The first round of shooting occurred at the moment worshippers bowed to their knees to perform sajda, a portion of prayer, when Muslims prostrated and touched their foreheads to the ground. Sheikh Mohammed Ziad Jabr, 60, believes Goldstein had meant to start shooting during ruku, the portion of the prayer when worshippers bent forward and placed their hands on their knees performed right before sajda, but had gotten confused. Since people were bowing to the ground, it helped many of us avoid the first round of shooting, Jabr says. Standing at the exact location where he was praying that day, this was Allah's mercy on us. According to Jabr, Goldstein, who was a physician in the Israeli army, threw a stun grenade right before the shooting. The shrapnel struck Jabr in his leg, leaving him unable to walk for about a week. Rajabi was in the third row from the imam, or the worship leader, was shot in the first round of shooting. One of the bullets hit his forearm, while another went right through his elbow, shattering his bones. He says the injuries were sustained from two different types of bullets, one of which was a dum-dum or expanding bullet. Further evidence, he says, that there was more than one shooter. I saw Goldstein standing between two other settlers, Rajabi tells me. They continued shooting until they ran out of bullets. One of the settlers grabbed a backup bag of bullets and began distributing them to others. When Goldstein ran out of bullets, he tried to escape through the gate beside Abraham's tomb, Rajabi continues, but it was locked and he got trapped. So people attacked him, beating him with anything they could find, but the other settlers managed to run away through other exits. Goldstein was beaten to death, his face becoming so disfigured that coroners could only identify him by the army ID tag dangling from his back. All I could think about was my wife and children, Rajabi adds. When he rushed toward the room where the women and children were praying, he immediately ran into 4 Israeli soldiers accompanied by several settlers, which convinced him that even the Israeli army was involved in the organized shooting. I found the women and children screaming and crying, Rajabi tells me, and then I started to lose consciousness due to the loss of blood and I collapsed on the ground. But the massacre in the Ibrahimi Mosque was just the beginning as fierce protests erupted outside of the mosque immediately following the massacre. More Palestinians were killed by the Israeli army. Others were killed outside the Khojaly Mosque, or a hospital, where Al-Khalil residents rushed to donate blood for the scores of wounded. Still others were killed in the local cemetery as they were burying their dead loved ones. Palestinians estimate that the final number of deaths was between 50 and 70, with about 250 more injured over the course of the day. Life would never be the same for Al-Khalil's residents, and the massacre would cement Israel's occupation over the city for decades to come. While Palestinians mourn their slain loved ones, hundreds of residents in Kiryat Arba, located on the outskirts of Al-Khalil, just a few minutes from the Ibrahimi Mosque, gathered to bury and pay respects to Goldstein, a man they deemed a fallen hero. Goldstein had resided in Kiryat Arba since immigrating to Israel from Brooklyn, New York in 1983. For these radical Jewish settlers, Goldstein was not a murderer but a savior for the Jewish people. Local imaginings built around him have reached biblical proportions, with residents claiming Goldstein is the third place behind King David and Samson, 2 biblical giants. Many here believe the unsubstantiated narrative that the Palestinians in Al-Khalil were planning an attack against Israelis and that Goldstein had merely staged a preemptive strike to save them. He's been referred to as the Angel of Kiryat Arba. For his supporters, even the timing of the massacre has deep significance in the Jewish tradition. According to the Book of Esther, the holiday of Purim celebrates the delivery of Jews from a genocidal plot organized by a minister of the Persian Empire named Haman. At the last moment, the plot was thwarted and Haman was hanged and his accomplices were killed. The Book of Esther was stolen from Turkey just recently in the discombobulation of the earthquake, and was returned. So it was stolen by Israeli soldiers who claimed to be rescuers and had to be returned, actually. Before descending down to the Ibrahimi Mosque to unleash violence that would in a split second transform Palestinian worship into wailing mourners, Goldstein had written a farewell note left behind at the small clinic where he had worked. May it be the will of Allah that you continue serving our blessed people faithfully, it said, with love of Israel and prayers for a full redemption. Goldstein's grave is located opposite the Meir Khan Memorial Park in Kiryat Arba. It still serves as a pilgrimage site for Jewish extremists, with his tomb inscribed with the words, "He gave his life for the people of Israel, its Torah and land." Like all of Israel's settlement in this occupied West Bank, Kiryat Arba, where about 7,326 settlers reside, is considered illegal under international law. It's long been considered a hub for Jewish extremism, but Goldstein's radicalization occurred years before he settled atop the rolling hills of the occupied West Bank. Goldstein was radicalized when he was still living on the concrete streets of Brooklyn, New York. In Brooklyn, Goldstein met Kahan, founder of the Jewish Defense League and the religious Zionist Koch political movement. Kahan, who was also from Brooklyn, eventually assassinated in New York City in 1990, often preached violence against Palestinians and called for the expulsion from Israel in the West Bank. Kahan, who served in the Israel Parliament in the 1980s, promoted enforcing halacha, or Jewish religious law, and encoding it into state law. He proposed laws such as banning relationships between Jews and non-Jews and formally separating Jewish and Arab neighborhoods. The follower of Kahan, and his ideologies are referred to as Kahanists. They support the full annexation of the occupied West Bank and believe the entire territory exclusively belongs to the Jews. Goldstein became very active in this movement while in Brooklyn, joining the paramilitary JDL, where he learned to fire a weapon. Kahan even performed Goldstein's marriage ceremony in Jerusalem, at the site where Jews believe the first temple commissioned by King Solomon had once stood. The site is known among Muslims as Al-Aqsa Mosque compound. This area is often a flashpoint between Palestinians and Israelis. After the massacre, the overwhelming majority of Israelis were appalled by the killings. Even now, almost 30 years later, the Kahanist movement remains on the extreme fringes of Israeli society, only espoused by the most radical Israeli settlers. There are, however, signs that that's changing. Shaul Majid is a distinguished fellow in Jewish studies at Dartmouth College in the U.S. and the author of the book Meir Khan, The Public Life and Political Thought of an American Jewish Radical. According to Majid, the late Kahan and his current followers believe that Israel is or should be a Jewish state in which Jews have domination over all the non-Jewish inhabitants, and if the non-Jewish inhabitants, meaning the Arabs, Palestinians, are not willing to acquiesce to this second-class status, then they have no right to be there. However, having spent years reporting from Israel and the occupied Palestine territory, I can affirm that this viewpoint is not so different from what one might overhear in cafes or bars in any major Israeli city. It's a sentiment I've heard firsthand from numerous Israelis on a typical night out in Tel Aviv. While these viewpoints are merely anecdotal, they nonetheless reveal the chilling popularization of these right-wing perspectives in Israel. Ben Giver is a self-described disciple of Cain and once has been a member of the New Outlaw Koch movement. In the past, Ben Giver has advocated for the expulsion of Palestinians from the country. He's also faced charges over hate speech against Palestinians in 2007 because of his involvement with the Koch party. He was convicted of supporting a terror organization. He was also charged for incitement to racism for carrying placards that read, "Expel the Arab enemy," and Rabbi Kahan was right. In an interview in 2021, Ben Giver denied that he was a pure ideological descendant of Kahan, claiming that, "I'm not Rabbi Kahan word for word. I wouldn't propose bills for separate beaches," and noted he disagreed with generalizing all Arabs or Palestinians, but he went on to express his appreciation for the late radical rabbi. "I think Rabbi Kahan was a holy man, a righteous man who fought for the Jewish people and was murdered for the sanctification of Allah's name."
What is this nothing you talk about?
In November last year, shortly before he was appointed National Security Minister in the new government, Ben Giver attended a commemoration event in honor of Kahan in Jerusalem, which is held each year. He stated that he would not advance legislation expelling all Palestinians from Israel and the West Bank or create a regime of ethnic separation statements that elicited booing from the audience. Will, of course, work and act to expel terrorists from Israel for the sake of Israel's Jewish character, for the sake of settlement, and for the sake of Jewish identity, he added. Archival footage of Kahan was also shown during the event, including one clip where he expressed his oft-repeated goal of expelling all Palestinians from Israel and the West Bank. Several stalls sold far-right merchandise, including bumper stickers stating, "Coexistence with the enemy doesn't exist," and "Transfer for the enemy." Ben Giver has already retroactively approved 9 settler outposts established in the West Bank, according to Israeli law. While government-approved Israeli settlements are considered legal, unauthorized Israeli settler outposts are illegal, but Ben Giver has called for the approval of more settlements in the West Bank. According to Kayla Vendor, a senior researcher associated at Britain-Israel Communications and Research, BICOM, Ben Giver's rise in popularity can be attributed to Israeli reactions to large-scale unrest and rioting in mixed Jewish Palestinian cities in Israel during May 2021. The turmoil erupted in response to Palestinians facing forcible evictions from the occupied East Jerusalem neighborhood of Sheikh Jarrah to make room for Israeli settlers. In addition, the Islamist Arab Party Ra'am, joining the coalition of Naftali Bennett, Israel's former prime minister, in June 2021, to boot Netanyahu out of power, created anger from the right-wingers. Ben-Gvir was able to harness opposition and fear of those events to onboard new support amongst many voters. He subsequently became the big winner of the elections, Ben-Dor tells me. Rather than being an indication of an increase in public support for Zionism, Ben-Gvir's popularity is more a testament to his success, like other far-right populists in the United States, Italy, Sweden, and France, of tapping into feelings among the public of being sidelined, disenfranchised, and fed up with traditional politicians, he adds. Majid, for his part, says the Zionist movement has grown because it's become more normalized, more acceptable in its broad parameters of a kind of Jewish chauvinism in Israel, he explains. One of the things that Ben-Gvir represents is a normalization of the ideology, but not necessarily advocating for the massacre of human beings. Majid continues, there's a certain kind of Jewish supremacy in the country. There's a growing number of people who feel that Palestinians are a threat and it's not their country and they don't have the right to the land. I don't think there's much sympathy in the country for Benjamin Goldstein besides a small slice of the population, but there's a growing sympathy for his larger worldview, he adds. A poll conducted in January 2023 found that around half of Jewish Israelis believe they should have more rights than Palestinian citizens in Israel. According to Ben-Dor, these feelings among Israelis have also manifested in response to an increase of armed Palestinian resistance movements in the West Bank, such as the Lion's Den, Nablus, and the Jenin Brigades. There have also been a series of deadly attacks against Israelis. Israeli army raids on West Bank cities have led to scores of Palestinians being killed, most recently this last Wednesday, when at least 10 Palestinians were killed and dozens injured in an Israeli raid on Nablus city. Since the start of 2023, at least 61 Palestinians, including 13 children, have already been killed by Israeli forces in the Palestinian territory. Ben-Gvir's politics have also emerged in the mainstream over decades, in which Israelis have become less concerned about the occupation. Majid says there was a time in the 1990s during Oslo when they thought maybe there would be a resolution, but I don't think most Israelis think that anymore, he explains. Most Israelis just don't care or think about the occupation. Therefore, some of the more radical settler ideologies espoused by the people like Ben-Gvir are just filling that vacuum. Jewish Israelis typically live their lives without thinking much about Israelis' more than half-century military occupation of the West Bank, but it's a reality that's defined the everyday life of Palestinians in Al-Khalil, with checkpoints, Jewish-only roads, and armed Israeli soldiers stripping them of any sense of normalcy. Following the massacre, Israeli authorities divided the Ibrahimi Mosque, with Muslim access reduced from the entire space to around 40% of the site. The other 60% was allocated to Jewish worshippers who accessed the site from a separate entrance. Instead of this massacre showing to the world the need to end this occupation, Israeli used it to further entrench it, Wazwaz says. Indignantly, in the end, the settlers were rewarded for murdering us and the victims were punished. Shahuda Street, the main road leading to the Ibrahimi Mosque that once functioned as Hebron's bustling economic artery, along with other parts of the city close to Israeli settlements, was closed off to Palestinian traffic. Hundreds of Palestinian businesses were shuttered. Checkpoints were also erected around the entrance to the mosque, forcing Palestinians to pass armed Israeli soldiers and metal detectors each time they enter for prayers. In 1997, Israel and the Palestinian Liberation Organization signed an agreement that saw Israeli hand over 80% of Al-Khalil, known as H1, to the Palestinian Authority while maintaining control over the remaining 20%. The latter portion, referred to as H2, includes 4 Israeli settlements that are home to hundreds of settlers. Within H2, Palestinian neighborhoods adjacent to the Israeli settlements have been restricted since the massacre. They are isolated from the rest of the city by Israeli military checkpoints and areas where only residents are allowed passage, so you're not allowed to even invite a friend or relative for a cup of tea at your house, says Hisham Sharabadi, the Hebron field researcher for Al-Haq, a Palestinian human rights organization. To enforce this, Israeli authorities block completely or put checkpoints around these neighborhoods. According to Sharabadi, there are 65 types of movement restrictions in the city, which include nearly 12 kilometers of road on which Palestinians are not allowed to drive, and out of those, there are about 2 kilometers where Palestinians are not even allowed to walk. Over the years, the restrictions on Palestinian movement in Hebron City or Al-Khalil have only gotten worse, he says. This has transformed even simply daily activities into a nightmare for Palestinians. Even something as simple as purchasing a washing machine involves coordinating with the Israeli army to bring it to your home because it cannot fit through the turnstiles. Especially during the summer months, Palestinians often face issues of water shortages, forcing the municipality to deliver water to Palestinian homes in large trucks. But for the Palestinians living in the restricted area where trucks cannot pass through the checkpoints, they're forced to collect water in a plastic container and carry them by hand through the checkpoints to their houses. Israel authorities make life horrible for the Palestinians. Sharabadi says these are 3 primary schools within the restricted area. There are 3 primary schools within the restricted area in which children are forced to pass checkpoints and have their backpacks searched by the Israeli army en route to school. According to Sharabadi, all of these Israeli restrictions placed on Palestinians in Khalil City are for a simple purpose: to force the Palestinian residents out. All of this contributes to what we believe is a project to annex a big part of the old city of Hebron in the eastern neighborhoods and add them to the settlement of Kiryat Arba, to declare the whole area as a Jewish Hebron entirely controlled by the Israelis, he tells me. Israel's supposed goal is working, according to Sharabadi. Before the Ibrahimi Mosque Massacre, the restricted area of the old city had a population of about 7,000 people. The numbers now fallen to less than 4,000. The Ibrahimi Mosque is at the center of these settlement plans, and the various Israeli restrictions have caused a significant decrease of Palestinian worshippers attending prayers there. Some Palestinians have to cross 4 checkpoints just to get to the mosque, Sharabadi explains. Since the youths are often the ones targeted by soldiers who search and harass them, it deters many of them from going to the mosque. Even families become worried and don't want their children going to mosque, which is the holiest site in the town, he continues. There are youths and even some older people who have not been to the mosque in the last 30 years. Despite the continued trauma Rajabi has dealt with for nearly 3 decades, following the massacre, he continues to brave the Israeli checkpoints, harassment, and daily searches to continue going to prayers at the Ibrahimi Mosque. While he still believes another massacre could be carried out at any moment, Rajabi says he doesn't have a single molecule of fear inside of him. All of this is to make us scared to go to the mosque so that we leave and the Israelis can take over. He rests his forearm, which still has a scar running down its length from when he was shot, on his knees as he sits on the carpet of the mosque. The mosque means the world to me, Rajabi says. If I pray outside of this mosque, I feel as if I didn't pray at all. The more the Israelis try to scare us, the more time I will spend at the mosque. We will never give it up, no matter how much they try and scare us. Israeli forces disperse rally marking 29th anniversary of Ibrahimi Mosque Massacre. Friday, February 24th, 2023, Wafa, Israeli forces Friday afternoon forcefully dispersed a rally marking the 29th anniversary of the Ibrahimi Mosque Massacre in the southern west bank of the city of Al-Khalil. The soldiers cracked down on the rally organized in denunciation of ongoing deadly Israeli army incursions across the West Bank, and on the eve of the 1994 Ibrahimi Mosque Massacre in the old city of Khalil, showering the participants with volleys of tear gas, canisters, concussion grenades, and ammunitions. A number of participants sustained gunshot injuries, including one seriously injured after being directly hit by a concussion bomb in the head, and several others by ammunition in their lower extremities. Dozens others suffered tear gas suffocation. 29 years ago, Israeli settler Benjamin Goldstein broke into the Ibrahimi Mosque and opened fire at Palestinian Muslim worshippers, killing 29. 4 Palestinians were killed on the same day in the clashes that broke out around the mosque in response to the massacre. In the aftermath, the mosque, known to Jews as Tomb of the Patriarchs, was divided into 2, with the larger part turned into a synagogue, while heavy scrutiny was imposed on the Palestinians in areas closed completely to them, including an important market in the main street, Shahuda Street. The city of Al-Khalil, which houses the Ibrahimi Mosque, is home to roughly 160,000 Palestinians and about 800 notoriously aggressive Israeli settlers who live in compounds heavily guarded by Israeli troops. Israel has expelled the only international monitors protecting Al-Khalil's Palestinians from 800 heavily guarded settlers, one of whom committed the 1994 massacre that triggered their deployment. Israeli forces killed Palestinian. Thousands protest violent raids. Israeli forces have killed 65 Palestinians, 35 of them children so far this year, the bloodiest such period. This is tangentially related, if I'm not mistaken. Let me hold on just to check. Just a second. Let me check on this article. All right, in Al-Khalil, Palestinians marched after Friday prayers to commemorate the 29th anniversary of the Ibrahimi Mosque Massacre in 1994. And this is from Al Jazeera. When an Israeli-American settler opened fire inside the mosque at drawn prayers, killing 29 Palestinians and wounding more than 100 others. In confrontations that broke out, Israeli forces injured at least 3 Palestinians in the Bab al-Zawiya area at the old city of Al-Khalil, the Palestinian Health Ministry said on Friday afternoon. The ministry said one of the men in serious condition after being hit in the head with a sound grenade, while the other 2 had light injuries from sound grenades and rubber-coated bullets. Confrontations broke out with Israeli forces in other areas of the occupied West Bank following Friday prayers, including the villages of Kiryut and Beta near Nablus, as well as Beit Enun and Arub refugee camp near Hebron. The deadly raid in Nablus on Wednesday marked the highest number of Palestinian fatalities in a single Israeli operation in the occupied West Bank since 2005, according to UN figures. It was also the third major Israeli operation in the West Bank since the start of the year, and under Israel's new extreme right-wing government, which was sworn in late December. Along with the nearly daily killings of Palestinians that have persisted for more than a year, the new governing coalition led by Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has been taking unilateral steps such as announcing major illegal settlement building projects, increasing demolitions of Palestinian homes, and imposing collective punitive measures against Palestinian prisoners, all of which threaten to cause an explosion situation on the ground. And from International Quran News Agency, Ibrahimi Mosque Massacre impacts continue 29 years later. 29 years ago today, the Ibrahimi Mosque Massacre happened, in which 29 Palestinian worshippers were killed and 150 others injured. Yet 29 years later, the victims are still paying the price for their massacre. On Friday, 25 February 1994, the 15th day of the holy Muslim fast month of Ramadan, the Jewish terrorist settler Benjamin Goldstein broke into the Ibrahimi Mosque, also known as Cave of the Patriarchs, because it includes shrines and tombs of prophets located in the southern West Bank city of Al-Khalil. As Muslims were performing their dawn prayers on Ramadan day and opened fire on the worshippers, killing 29 on the spot before he was neutralized by the worshippers. The Israeli occupation soldiers present in the area closed the gates on the mosque to prevent the worshippers from leaving, and they also prevented those coming from outside from entering in to help the wounded. But the 29 were not only the victims of that massacre that same day. The occupation soldiers opened fire at Palestinians participating in the funerals of the dead, killing 21 more people. While tension escalating in the occupied territories, soldiers opened fire at protesters the next day, killing 10 more and wounding hundreds of others. Following the massacre, the occupation forces closed the Ibrahimi Mosque and Al-Khalil's old city for a full 6 months, claiming to investigate the crime. They unilaterally formed the Shamgar Commission to investigate the massacre and its causes, which came out at the time with several recommendations, all against the victims and favoring the terrorists. The recommendations included dividing the Ibrahimi Mosque between Muslims and Jews, creating new facts on the ground that worsened living conditions for the area's Palestinian residents, tightened security around the Holy Mosque, giving the occupation authorities full control over the mosque in order to continue to turn into a Jewish shrine, and preventing the call to prayer from its minarets many times during the year, as well as closing it for Muslim worshiping many times in the year while opening it for only Jewish worship. Shortly after the occupation, authorities placed cameras and electronic gates at all entrances leading to the mosque area, closed most of the roads leading to it to Muslims, with the exception of one gate, with strict military measures, closed the popular vegetable market El Hispa, the Al Khalil and Shaheen Khans, and Al Shahuda and Al Salah streets. With these measures, the old town was separated from its surroundings, measures that are still in place today and are even harsher. Their impact on the life of thousands of Palestinians who live in that area is very visible to anyone who goes there. The terrorist Benjamin Goldstein, whose real name was not Baruch Goldstein, was 42 years old when he committed the massacre. He was one of the founders of the Jewish Territory Koch movement. Goldstein was born in New York City into an Orthodox Jewish family and got his education at Jewish yeshiva schools in Brooklyn, got his degree in medicine from the Albert Einstein College of Medicine at Yeshiva University. He went to occupied Palestine from the United States in 1980 and lived in Kiryat Arba settlement, which was built on usurped Al Khalil lands and houses the most extremist and racist Israeli settlers. And we'll be back with more All Access News. Jordan hosts Israel-Palestine talks as violence escalates. Jordan official says the talks in the Red Sea port of Aqaba is part of an effort to halt a security breakdown that could fuel more violence. Jordan's hosting a meeting between top Israeli and Palestinian officials in a bid to halt a surge in deadly violence in the occupied West Bank that stoked fears of wider escalation, according to officials. The meeting on Sunday is being held in the Red Sea port of Aqaba and will be attended by representatives from the U.S. and Egypt. And from MiddleEastEye.net, talks between Palestinian and Israeli officials kick off in Jordan. American and Egyptian representatives also set to attend as talks take place following escalating violence. Israel and Palestine leadership begin talks in Jordan on Sunday, following a deadly escalation in violence in the occupied West Bank. The meeting's being held in the Red Sea resort town of Aqaba, according to Jordanian state broadcaster Al Mamlaka. Palestinian intelligence chief Majed Faraj and Israel's Shin Bet domestic security agency head Ronan Bar were both set to attend, sources told AFP. U.S. National Security Council Coordinator for the Middle East and North Africa Brett McGurk is also expected to be present, as well as Jordanian and Egyptian security officials, the sources add. The talks come after Israeli forces killed 11 Palestinians, including child and 3 elderly people, and wounded 100 others on Wednesday during a military raid in the occupied West Bank city of Nablus. More than 60 Israeli military vehicles stormed Nablus after an undercover force was spotted in the historic old city, eyewitness told Middle East Eye. It was very scary. We could hear the sounds of explosions and people screaming in the street, and many of us started crying and praying to Allah to protect the city and its residents, Nablus resident Nabila Suleiman told MEE. The raid, which lasted for 4 hours, focused on building in the city that reportedly housed Palestinian resistance fighters. Israel's military launched airstrikes on the Gaza Strip on Thursday morning after rockets were fired from the besieged Palestinian enclave following the Nablus raid. At least 62 Palestinians have been killed by Israelis this year, at a rate of more than 1 fatality per day. This follows a steep increase in violence in 2022, when at least 167 Palestinians were killed in the West Bank and East Jerusalem, the highest death toll in these territories in a single year since the Second Intifada. Meanwhile, Palestinians killed 30 Israelis last year and 10 this year. United Nations experts have condemned Israel for the record levels of violence in 2022 and warned that an even higher number of casualties could be recorded this year. The U.S. CIA Director William Burns warned earlier this month that current tensions bear an unhappy resemblance to the Second Intifada, and efforts to prevent explosions of violence are a challenge. The decision to take part in the Aqaba meeting, despite the pain and massacres being endured by the Palestinian people, comes from a desire to bring an end to the bloodshed, the Fatah movement, which President Mahmoud Abbas belongs to, said on Twitter. And from Harwich, Jordan, to host senior Israel and Palestinian security officials in bid to quell violence. Representatives from Egypt, Jordan, and the United States will also be present at the meeting in Aqaba, with attendees expected to include Shin Bet Security Service Chief Ronan Bar and Confronts of Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas. And remember to like, share, and subscribe. Your engagement through any of those three will accelerate us at warp speed towards the continuation of our mission to truthfully go where no news will have been going before. Watch this space. Azerbaijan throws into disarray another anti-Karabakh project. What comes next? This is Azer News. Reinvigorated by its unconvincing victory in 2020 on the Karabakh battlefield, the government of Azerbaijan has been steadfastly pushing forward skillfully devised own projects through political and diplomatic means that were impossible militarily in the region of South Caucasus, crisscrossed with the interests of nations with imperialistic past and the least care to Azerbaijan's the national interests. Plans hatched in the backrooms of the pro-Armenian state special services and think tanks to steal Azerbaijan's victory were, are, and will never cease, and the only viable way of preventing them is for the Azerbaijani government to have steel nerve and determination reinforced by the nation's military and economic power. No plans, irrespective of their size and complexity, will derail the Azerbaijani state's drive towards unity, sovereignty, and ability to defend its own national interests politically and militarily, provided all the basic components are in place. The fiasco of another Karabakh plan. Azerbaijan has watered down another project vis-a-vis Karabakh, We are not in the know-how, and when Ruben Vardanyan, notorious for running several money laundering projects in post-Soviet Russia, found himself in the crosshairs of the Russian special services. However, what we know is that Vardanyan came to the possession of billions of dollars in the boom of the seizure of former Soviet plants, factories, and natural resources in the late 1990s, backed by the then Russian Special Service. On September 1st, 2022, he found himself in the part of Karabakh where the Russian peacekeepers are in temporary control of until 2025 to play an intermediary role in bringing ethnic Armenians back to Baku's all-out control. However, these newfound saviors' virgin speech immediately laid bare whose project he was and what was behind his secondment to the region, for which Azerbaijan shed the blood of the bravest sons and daughters to win it back in 2020. Some 100 days ago, he was escorted to Karabakh and portrayed as a future savior, but now on 23 February, he was ordered to abandon the unfulfilled plan and leave the region in disgrace. His masters might have at least taken care of the date sacred for Russia, but he was not even spared to this end though symbolic. Vardanyan's defeat is actually the case for Russia. However, to Vardanyan's hypothesis, this game continues in his own world. The defeated macho is still taking his last breath, addressing his scarce supporters last night through his tweet account. Remaining loyal to his behavior model, the tough guy tweeted from Moscow to pretend he is in Azerbaijan's Khojaly, bragging he would continue his mission now unaccomplished forever. Vardanyan physically sees that he's been thrown long ago on the list of the vanquished, but he either struggles to understand it mentally or he tries to deceive himself. One is why he's not going out to his beloved supporters in Khojaly, where he found shelter for 100 days, but instead he inspires them to struggle against Azerbaijan via his tweet and in English. This is a weird place he's been for 100 days, let me tell you. He was fired without his physical presence when the decision was made in the local self-made parliament, where he's accoladed and praised. The question is, if he's in Karabakh, why was he not present in person? Vardanyan in limbo for Russia. Although Russia has so far implemented hundreds of plans related to Karabakh, its comprehensive relations with Azerbaijan are better than hundreds of pawns like Vardanyan. Russia once again proved oligarchs who fail its plan are useless tools, and the same fate is now shared by Vardanyan. The reason for this is, first of all, Azerbaijan's stern covert or overt pressure mechanism on Armenia and even on Russia, now cornered in all senses of the word. At the MSC, Ilham Aliyev first openly and harshly stated that the name of Nagorno-Karabakh is no more valid. In addition, Russia began to understand the failure of Vardanyan in the same scenario plans related to him, the impact of peaceful pickets being carried on the Lachin-Kendi Road with the participation of Azerbaijani eco-activists for 75 days. It's been spelled two different ways in this article. No blockade but control, the reason that botches the plan. Finally, there are reasons behind Vardanyan's failure, that is current Armenian government's dissatisfaction with the far-reaching plan codenamed Vardanyan, and his ambitions for the highest post in Armenia, which scared the Pashinyan government. According to a plenary session, the Azerbaijani president ruled out any contact with the man smuggled into and out of Karabakh, who's neither moral nor physical right to speak on behalf of 30,000 strong ethnic Armenians in Karabakh. But not with the person who's exported from Russia to have the leading position in Karabakh. Maybe export is not the right word. I'd probably prefer the word smuggled into, because nobody knows how he emerged in Karabakh, and he's trying and achieving to go back to Yerevan, and from there to Moscow, and then back to Yerevan, and then to Karabakh. Only this fact demonstrates. This once again gives the reason that Azerbaijan's complete control over the Kendi Road will put an end to the shameful end of the pseudo-heroes with the exposure of the next scenarios. And from Urdu Point, Azerbaijan says ICJ sees environment protests on Karabakh Road as genuine. Azerbaijan's Deputy Foreign Minister Elnur Mammadov argued Thursday that the International Court of Justice's ruling on his country's feud with Armenia over Nagorno-Karabakh proved that it did not see Azeri protesters blocking a vital road between Armenia and the disputed regions as Baku's agents. Azerbaijan's Deputy Foreign Minister Elnur Mammadov argued that Thursday that the International Court of Justice ruling on country's feud with Armenia over Nagorno-Karabakh proved that it didn't see Azeri protesters blocking a vital road between Armenia and the disputed region as Baku's agents. Our side presented the court with evidence that these protests had been organized by environmental activists, including the activists' names, photos, and videos, Mammadov told a briefing in Baku. In its decision published on Wednesday, the court rejected Armenia's application and its suggestion that the Azerbaijani government organized the protests. The deputy foreign minister added, "The United Nations main judicial body ruled Wednesday that Azerbaijan must ensure unimpeded movement along the Lachen corridor, which has been blocked since December by people whom Azerbaijan describes as environmental activists protesting illegal mining operations in the area." Armenia argued in the court filing that they were acting on Baku's command and demanded that it cease its orchestration and support of the protest. The ICJ ruled that no action on that was warranted. Azerbaijan marks 31st anniversary of Khojaly massacre. February 26 marks a tragic event when Armenian forces committed massacre known as Khojaly genocide of ethnic Azerbaijanis. On February 26, Azerbaijan will observe the 31st anniversary of the Khojaly tragedy. Azerbaijan will observe the 31st anniversary of the Khojaly tragedy, the mass killing of Azerbaijani civilians by Armenian forces in the town of Khojaly. To mark the event, the Azerbaijani foreign minister issued a statement calling the 92 Khojaly genocide one of the gravest crimes committed against the civilian population during the decades-long aggression of Armenia against Azerbaijan. The ministry said the Khojaly tragedy, the indiscriminate killing of the civilian population, is only a part of the policy of ethnic hatred, racial discrimination, and systematic violence implemented by Armenia against Azerbaijan for many years at the state level. The statement also published a list of the international documents violated by Armenia during its aggression against Azerbaijan. The ministry said that it's possible to open an international investigation against Armenia under the international law, adding that to date none of those involved in the massacre were brought to justice in Armenia. The ministry recalled incriminating remarks by Armenia's then defense minister and ex-president Serge Sargsyan, who told British journalist Thomas DeWall that before Khojaly, the Azerbaijanis thought that the Armenians were people who could not raise their hand against the civilian population. We were able to break that stereotype. According to the Justice for Khojaly project at the end of 1987, then Armenian Soviet Republic openly laid claim to the territory of the Nagorno-Karabakh Autonomous Oblast of the Azerbaijani Soviet Republic. After the dissolution of the Soviet Union in October 1991, Khojaly, a district located in the mountainous Karabakh region of Azerbaijan, home to some 7,000 people, was completely surrounded by Armenia's armed forces. On the night of February 25th through 26th, following massive artillery bombardment, Armenia's military, together with former USSR's 366th Motorized Infantry Regiment, occupied Khojaly. According to the Justice for Khojaly, of 7,000 Khojaly residents, 5,379 were deported and 613 people, including 63 children, 106 women, and 70 elderly citizens were murdered by the Armenian occupation forces. Besides, 1,275 residents were taken hostage and tortured. 487 were injured, while the fate of 150 captives, including 68 women and 26 children, remains unknown. The actions of the Armenian armed forces tore families apart. 8 families were completely wiped out. 130 children lost one parent, and 25 children lost both parents. Commemorations of Khojaly tragedy. According to the Azerbaijani authorities, the parliaments of 18 countries, 24 U.S. states, the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, and the Organization of Turkish States adopted a number of documents condemning the mass killing of civilians in Khojaly and characterizing it as a crime against humanity and an act of genocide. Memorials dedicated to the Khojaly tragedy have been erected in several cities of Azerbaijan, including capital Baku, Bosnia and Herzegovina, Germany, Israel, Mexico, and Turkey. Meanwhile, the Azerbaijani foreign minister expects that measures taken at the national level, also effective from the point of view of international law, will serve to end impunity and bring to justice those responsible for serious crimes committed during Armenia's aggression against Azerbaijan. There has to be a legal assessment on the Khojaly genocide, and those who committed this terrible tragedy should receive its proper punishment. We engrave the victims of the Khojaly tragedy in our national memory and honor their reminiscence. Rest in peace, it said. And from Baku News TV, this is a short on the Khojaly genocide.
Dear friends, dear Baku News guests, dear visitors, today we will talk about the Khojaly genocide in Azerbaijan Democratic Republic against the Azerbaijani people, Khojaly genocide. It should be mentioned that Azerbaijan has endured ethnic cleansing and genocide by Armenians and nationalists, chauvinists for 200 years. The people of Azerbaijan were deported from their historical lands and became refugees and internally displaced persons because of Armenian occupation. Azerbaijanis were also forced from their historical lands. During the Soviet period, 150,000 Azerbaijanis were deported from Armenia and placed in the Kur-Araz plain from 1948 to 1953. 20,000 Azerbaijanis were forced from their historical territories in 1988, and Armenia became a mono-ethnic state. The Nagorno-Karabakh events, which begins in 1988, along which continuous efforts to implement the Armenian desire of building a state from sea to sea, led to the destruction of towns and villages, murder of thousands of innocent people, as well as exile of hundreds of thousands of Azerbaijanis from their native lands. The Armenian government wanted to annex Nagorno-Karabakh despite international legal norms and demonstrates their readiness and resource to any kind of crime and barbarism for the sake of its ideology. The Khojaly genocide, the tragedy of the 20th century, was a result of this aggressive and criminal policy. This tragedy, which took place in the 20th century, was one of the most serious crimes, not only against the people of Azerbaijan, but humanity as a whole. The Khojaly genocide is comparable to the genocides in Khatyn, Hiroshima, Nagasaki, and Songma. What was Armenia's purpose in Khojaly? On one hand, that liquidation of the strategic hindrance in the form of Azerbaijan residents of the mountainous part of Nagorno-Karabakh. One of the other hand that was the raising of Khojaly to the crown. Because Khojaly was an inhabited place which reflects the history and the traditions of Azerbaijani since the ancient times. This district culture is classified as Nagorno-Karabakh in the Azerbaijan history. Armenian military forces committed genocides in the town of Khojaly with a population of 7,000 people on February 26, 1992. There were 3,000 people in the town at the time of Armenian military forces attack. As most part of the population had to leave a town during 4 months blockade. 613 people were killed, 1,000 peaceful people of different age became invalid during Khojaly tragedy. 106 women, 63 children, 70 old men were killed. 8 families were completely annihilated. 130 children lost one parent, while 25 both of them lost their parents. 1,275 peace residents were taken hostage. The fate of 150 of them still unknown. All these were committed by Armenian militaries with special mercilessness and inconceivable barbarism. Khojaly refugees write in their address to the UN Organization on Security and Cooperation in Europe. In the world, international conventions, laws passed in the world criticize genocides like Khojaly tragedy and call them inadmissible. The crime should not remain without punishment. Armenian military political aggression must be condemned by world community, international organizations, parliaments of the world states must give political, legal appraisal of Khojaly genocide. Military crime committed by the Armenian Republic in the Azerbaijan territories.
And from news.az, Columbia University hosts a conference dedicated to Khojaly genocide. A conference dedicated to the 31st anniversary of the Khojaly genocide has been held in Columbia University in New York City, USA. The theme of remembering Khojaly, Armenia, and Azerbaijan through military and peaceful means. The main aim of the visit was to raise awareness about the Khojaly genocide and convey the real facts about the current situation in Karabakh, to prevent disinformation and to draw attention to the process of peace and normalization in this region. Columbia University staff, diaspora members living in New York City and other states participated in the conference. First event, participants commemorated the memory of the victims of the Khojaly genocide and the war, as well as those who died as a result of the devastating earthquake in Turkey. A film dedicated to the Khojaly genocide was shown. Ali Asgharov, professor of the Department of Peace and Conflict Studies at the University of North Carolina, and Michael Gunter, professor of political science at Tennessee Institute of Technology, acted as speakers of the conference. It was noted that perpetrators of the Khojaly genocide should be punished. The audience was informed about brutal deportation of Azerbaijanis from ancient Azerbaijani lands, present-day Armenia. The participants of the event were presented brochures about the Khojaly genocide prepared by Haydar Aliyev Foundation, badges, and discs of the movie Endless Corridor. And from CaspianNews.com, Azerbaijani Mine Action Agency gets 5 more detention dogs. Azerbaijani's Mine Action Agency has recently been provided with additional mine detection dogs from the Marshall Legal or Legacy Institute, the MLI, based in the U.S. These dogs will aid in the continued efforts to clear landmines in territories that were liberated from Armenian occupation in 2020. The transfer is part of an agreement signed in April 2021 for the supply of a total of 50 specially trained life-saving mine detection dogs after completing relevant preparations and accreditation based on the International Mine Action Standards, IMAS. The newly procured mine detection dogs will be deployed in Azerbaijan's liberated areas. MLI supplied a total of 65 life-saving mine detection dogs to Anama. Currently, Anama is using 25 dogs to assist the full-fledged mine action campaign. The Karabakh and Izan-Gazur regions of Azerbaijan had been heavily mined by Armenia's forces since the 1990s. Following the Soviet Union's dissolution in 1991, Armenia launched a full-blown military assault against Azerbaijan. The bloody war lasted until a ceasefire in 1994 and saw Armenia occupying 20% of Azerbaijan's internationally recognized territories. Over 30,000 Azerbaijanis were killed and 1 million others were expelled from those lands in a brutal ethnic cleansing campaign carried out by Armenia. On September 27, 2020, the decades-old conflict between the two countries reignited after Armenia's forces illegally deployed in occupied Azerbaijani lands, shelled military positions and civilian settlements of Azerbaijan. During the counterattack, operations that lasted 44 days, Azerbaijan forces liberated over 300 settlements, including the cities of Jabrail, Fuzili, Zangilan, Kubadli, and Shusha from the Armenian occupation. The war ended with a tripartite statement signed on November 10, 2020 by Armenia, Azerbaijan, and Russia, under which Armenia also returned the occupied Agdam, Kalbajar, and Lachin districts to Azerbaijan. Since the end of the hostilities, the Azerbaijani government has been carrying out demining operations in the liberated territories to expedite the return of the internally displaced persons. Anama's mine disposal team specialists from the Ministry of Emergency Situations, the Border Services Command, and the Turkish Armed Forces have been conducting demining operations in the liberated territories. Anama deploys cutting-edge Turkish, British, Slovak, and Croatian production machinery to facilitate the process. A minesweeper of local production known as Revival P1 also joined the mine action. The agencies also signed a contract with the British RP's NRC company to conduct aerial research in the liberated territories using drones and various devices. As of February 2023, a total of 64,000, that is 150,000 acres of the liberated territories of Azerbaijan had been cleared of mines since November 2020. Over 28,000 mines and more than 39,000 unexploded ordnances have been detected during demining activities. Despite extensive efforts, the demining operations faced many challenges due to Armenia's refusal to hand over maps displaying the locations of the landmines. Azerbaijan obtained minefield maps from Armenia from the Agdam, Fuzuli, and Zangilan districts, which were previously occupied and which reportedly identified the coordinates of 189,000 anti-tank and anti-personnel mines. Armenia also provided the Azerbaijani side with mine maps of other liberated territories of Azerbaijan. However, Anama reported that these maps were just 2% effective in mine action. According to Azerbaijan's foreign ministry, Armenia has been reprehensibly targeting civilian homes and settlements with explosive and landmines, killing or injuring 282 Azerbaijanis in mine explosions since the end of the 44-day war in 2020. International experts estimate that it will take nearly 30 years and $25 billion to solve issues related to demining. 31 years passed since Khojaly genocide. On February 25, 1992, Armenian armed forces attacked the city of Khojaly with the help of armed vehicles and military personnel of the 366th motorized regiment stationed in Kankindi since the USSR period. 2,500 Khojaly residents who remained in the encircled town began to move towards Agdam. but Armenians attacked them from ambush. As a result of the Khojaly genocide, which a tragedy of centuries, 613 civilians, 62 children, 106 women, and 70 old people were killed atrociously. 8 families were completely annihilated. 25 children lost their parents. 130 children lost one parent. 487 were wounded. 76 of them are children. Some 1,275 innocent residents were taken hostage, while the fate of 150 people, including 68 women and 26 children, still remains unknown. According to official estimates, the destruction and looting of the state and private property due to the occupation of Khojaly city by illegal Armenian armed groups caused $170 million in damage to the property of the state and people of Azerbaijan. A monument to victims of the Khojaly genocide was erected in 1993 in the Khojaly district of Baku. In 1994, a resolution on 26 February, the day of the Khojaly genocide, was issued with the initiative of Heydar Aliyev at the Milli Majlis of the Republic of Azerbaijan. The document describes the cause of the tragedy and its perpetrators. Since February 2008, the Justice for Khojaly campaign has been held on the initiative of Leyla Aliyeva, General Coordinator of the Intercultural Dialogue of the Youth Forum of the Organization of the Islamic Conference. The aim of the campaign is to inform the international community about the Khojaly tragedy and to give a moral and political assessment of the tragedy in the international arena, and to ensure its commemoration of the international level. The international coordination of the campaign is carried out through the website justiceforkhojaly.org. The anniversary of the Khojaly genocide is sadly celebrated every year in Azerbaijan and many countries around the world. Every year, on February 26, Azerbaijani embassies and diaspora organizations organize commemorative ceremonies and conferences in the 6 countries where they operate. At these events, photo stands reflecting the atrocities committed by Armenians in Khojaly and documentaries and books reflecting the realities of the genocide are exhibited. At present, the national legislatures of 18 countries as well as 24 U.S. states, as well as the Organization of Islamic Cooperation and the Organization of Turkiye States, have adopted numerous resolutions and decisions condemning the massacre of civilians in Khojaly and assessing it as an act of genocide and a crime against humanity. Terror-based policy of Armenia, Khojaly genocide. Exactly 31 years have passed since one of the bloodiest crimes against humanity, the Khojaly genocide, happened. On the night of February 26, 1992, the Armenian Armed Forces, together with the 366th Motorized Rifle Regiment of the Army of the former USSR, brutally killed 613 residents of Khojaly and 63 children, 106 women, 70 elderly people. 8 families were completely destroyed. 25 children lost both parents, 130 children lost one parent, and 1,275 people were taken hostage. The Khojaly genocide is an integral part of the systemic and pre-planned terror policy of Armenians against Azerbaijanis. The Armenians started this policy of terror long before the Khojaly genocide, since 1987. First, they began to oppress Azerbaijanis with administrative methods in Khojaly and Yerevan. Later, they have further expanded their claims and launched organizing armed attacks on the settlements of Azerbaijanis there. As a result, Western Azerbaijanis were deported from their native lands. Then the attacks of Armenians on unarmed Azerbaijanis became even more intense. The Armenians committed a massacre in the village of Baganis, Aram, in the Gazakh region bordering Armenia. Then, during the occupation of the Azerbaijani villages of Emirad, Karvan, Tug, Salakatan, Akhulu, Khojaly, Jamili, Nabalar, Mashali, Ghasanabad, Kirkajan, Gaibali, Malibeli, Yukhara, and Ashagi Gushalar. Gardagli in Karabakh, part of the civilian population of these settlements, was brutally killed by Armenians. On February 17, 1992, several massacres were committed by Armenians against Azerbaijanis in the village of Garadagli of the Khojaly region in April 1992, in the village of Agdaban of the Kalbajar region in August, in the village of Balagia of the Goranboy region in April 1993, in the village of Bashlibel of the Kalbajar region. That's the Armenians systematically committed crimes against the Azerbaijani people in the late 80s and the early 90s. The Armenian authorities provided special financial and military support to the armed formations that shed the Azerbaijani blood. Late Armenian officials themselves recognized these crimes against Azerbaijanis. The Armenian writer Khojaly executioner Zori Balayan, in his book named The Revival of Our Soul, published in 1996, justifies the Khojaly genocide and proudly admits the commitment of this genocide against Azerbaijans. When Khashatur and I entered one of the houses, our soldiers nailed a 13-year-old Turk to the window. Then I stripped the skin of the 13-year-old Turk on his stomach, head, and chest. I looked at my watch. 7 minutes later, the child died from pain and blood loss. My spirit was filled with joy. Then Khashatur dismembered the corpse of the murdered child and threw it to the dogs. In the evening, we did the same with 3 more Turkic children. I fulfilled my duty as a person who loves Armenians. I knew that every Armenian would be proud of our actions. It's clear that the Armenians wanted to intimidate the Azerbaijani people of these crimes with such confessions, but Azerbaijani thwarted this plan of the Armenians. They failed to frighten the people, and the crimes committed by the Armenians were not forgotten. Retribution for Khojaly took place on the battlefield during the 44-day war, which ended the victory of the Azerbaijani army under the leadership of the Supreme Commander-in-Chief, President Ilham Aliyev, Although the Armenians systematically killed Azerbaijani civilians during the First Karabakh War and continued their policy of terror during the 44-day war, Azerbaijan did not respond in the same way. Azerbaijani army avenged Khojaly on the battlefield, not hurting the civilian population. Nevertheless, the Armenian authorities continued their policy of terror, bombarding civilians in Ganja, Barda, Mingachevir, and our other cities during the 44-day war. The terror policy of Armenia against the Azerbaijani people continues to this day, just in a different form. Currently, Armenia is pursuing a policy of mind terror against Azerbaijan, despite the fact that more than 2 years have passed since the crushing defeat of the Armenians on the battlefield. They still have not provided the Azerbaijani side with accurate maps of minefields. As a result, civilians in Khojaly, Terter, Fazuli, Agdam, and other regions regularly become victims of mine terror. According to the latest statistics, after the Second Karabakh War ended, 260 people became the victims of the mines. 44 of them died, and more than 200 people received injuries. That's the terrorist policy of Armenia towards Azerbaijan continues to these days, that is. The Armenians who penetrated the houses of the unarmed Azerbaijani population in Khankendi and western Azerbaijan in the late 1980s and committed terror there began to pursue an occupation policy in the early 1990s. Later, they continued the policy of terror, firing at the civilian population living on the Armenian-Azerbaijani border and in the frontline zone. And now they continue their terrorist policy in the form of mine terror, which is the main threat to the peace in the region. And make sure you watch this space. Remember that your engagement through a like, a share, and a subscribe will propel us at warp speed towards the continuation of our mission to truthfully go where no news will have been going before. U.S. Hegemony and its Perils. This is from cgtn.com. U.S. Hegemony and its Perils from the Chinese government on U.S. Leadership, I guess you could call it. Political hegemony throwing its weight around. Military hegemony, wanton use of force. Economic hegemony, looting and exploitation. And technological hegemony, monopoly and suppression. Finally, cultural hegemony, spreading false narratives. Introduction. Since becoming the world's most powerful country after the two world wars and the Cold War, the U.S. has acted more boldly to interfere in the international affairs or the internal affairs of other countries. Pursue, maintain and abuse hegemony, advance subversion and infiltration, and willfully wage wars, bringing harm to the international community. The U.S. has developed a hegemonic playbook to stage color revolutions, instigate regional disputes, and even directly launch wars under the guise of promoting democracy, freedom, and human rights, clinging to the Cold War mentality. The U.S. has ramped up bloc politics and stoked conflict and confrontation. It's overstretched the concept of national security, abused export controls, and forced unilateral sanctions upon others. It's taken a selective approach to international law and rules, utilizing or discarding them as it sees fit, and has sought to impose rules that serve its own interests in the name of upholding rules-based international order. This report, by presenting the relevant facts, seeks to expose the U.S. abuse of hegemony in the political, military, economic, financial, technological, and cultural fields, and to draw greater international attention to the perils of the U.S. practices to world peace and stability and the well-being of all peoples. Political hegemony, throwing its weight around. The U.S. has been long attempting to mold other countries in the world order with its own values and political system in the name of promoting democracy and human rights. Instances of U.S. interference in other countries' internal affairs abound in the name of promoting democracy. The U.S. practiced the Neo-Monroe Doctrine in late Latin America, instigated color revolutions in Eurasia, and orchestrated the Arab Spring in West Asia and North Africa, bringing chaos and disaster to many countries. In 1823, the United States announced the Monroe Doctrine while touting an America for the Americans. What's truly wanted was an America for the United States. Since then, the policies of successive U.S. governments toward Latin America and the Caribbean region have been riddled with political interference, military intervention, and regime subversion. From its 61-year hostility toward and blockade of Cuba to its overthrow of the Allende government of Chile, U.S. policy on this region has been built on one maxim: those who submit will prosper. Those who resist shall perish. This year, 2003, marked the beginning of the successive color revolutions: the Rose Revolution in Georgia, the Orange Revolution in Ukraine, the Tulip Revolution in Kyrgyzstan. The U.S. Department of State openly admitted playing a central role in those regime changes. The U.S. also interfered in the international affairs of the Philippines, ousting President Ferdinand Marcos Sr. in 1986 and Joseph Estrada in 2001 through the so-called People Power revolutions. In January 2023, former U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo released his new book, Never Give an Inch, Fighting for the America I Love. He revealed in it that the United States had plotted to intervene in Venezuela. The plan was to force the Maduro government to reach an agreement with the opposition, deprive Venezuela of its ability to sell oil and gold for foreign exchange, exert high pressure on its economy, and influence the 2018 presidential election. The U.S. exercises double standards on international rules, placing its self-interest first. The U.S. has walked away from international treaties and organizations and put its domestic law above international law. In April 2017, the Trump administration announced that it would cut off all U.S. funding to the UNFPA, the United Nations Population Fund, with the excuse that the organization supports or participates in the management of a program or coercive abortion or involuntary sterilization. The U.S. quit UNESCO twice in 1984 and 2017. In 2017, it announced leaving the Paris Agreement on climate change. In 2018, it announced its exit from the UN Human Rights Council, citing the organization's bias against Israel and failure to protect human rights effectively. In 2019, the U.S. announced its withdrawal from the Intermediate-Range Nuclear Forces Treaty to seek the unfettered development of advanced weapons. In 2020, it announced pulling out of the Treaty on Open Skies. The U.S. has also been been a stumbling block to biological arms control by opposing negotiations on a verification protocol for the Biological Weapons Convention and impeding internal verification of countries' activities relating to biological weapons. As the only country in possession of a chemical weapon stockpile, the U.S. has repeatedly delayed the destruction of chemical weapons and remained reluctant in fulfilling its obligation. It's become the biggest obstacle to realizing a world free of chemical weapons. The U.S. is piecing together small blocks through its alliance system. It's been forcing an Indo-Pacific strategy onto the Asia-Pacific region, assembling exclusive clubs like the Five Eyes, the Quad, and the AUKUS, and forcing regional countries to take sides. Such practices are essentially meant to create division in the region, stoke confrontation, and undermine peace. The U.S. arbitrarily passes judgment on democracy in other countries and fabricates a false narrative of democracy versus authoritarianism to incite estrangement, division, rivalry, and confrontation. In December 2021, the U.S. hosted the first Summit for Democracy, which drew criticism for opposition from many countries for making a mockery of the spirit of democracy and dividing the world. In March 2023, the U.S. will host another Summit for Democracy, which remains unwelcome and will again find no support. Military hegemony, wanton use of force. The history of the U.S. is characterized by violence and expansion since it gained independence in 1776. The U.S. has constantly sought expansion by force. It slaughtered Indians, invaded Canada, waged a war against Mexico, instigated the American-Spanish War, and annexed Hawaii. After World War II, the wars either provoked or launched by the U.S. included the Korean War, the Vietnam War, the Gulf War, the Kosovo War, the war in Afghanistan, the Iraq War, Libyan, and the Syrian War, abusing its military hegemony to pave the way for expansionist objectives. In recent years, the U.S. average annual military budget has exceeded $700 billion, accounting for 40% of the world's totals, more than the 15 countries behind it combined. The U.S. states has about 800 overseas military bases with 173,000 troops deployed in 159 countries. According to the book America Invades, How We've Invaded or Been Militarily Involved with Almost Every Country on Earth, the United States has far been militarily involved with almost all the 190-odd countries recognized by the United Nations, with only 3 exceptions. The 3 countries were spared because the U.S. did not find them on the map. A former U.S. President, Jimmy Carter, put it in the United States is undoubtedly the most warlike nation in the history of the world. According to a Tufts University report introducing the Military Intervention Project, a new data set on U.S. military inventions, 1776 to 2019, the U.S. undertook nearly 400 military interventions globally between those years, 34% of which were in Latin America and the Caribbean, 23% in East Asia and the Pacific, 14% in the Middle East and North Africa, and 13% in Europe. Currently, its military intervention in the Middle East and North Africa and Sub-Saharan Africa is on the rise. Alex Lowe, a South China Morning Post columnist, pointed out that the U.S. has rarely distinguished between diplomacy and war since its founding. It overthrew democratically elected governments in many developing countries in the 20th century and immediately replaced them with American puppet regimes. Today in Ukraine, Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya, Syria, Pakistan, and Yemen, the U.S. is repeating its old tactics of waging proxy, low-intensity, and drone wars. U.S. military hegemony has caused humanitarian tragedies. Since 2001, the wars and military operations launched by the U.S. in the name of fighting terrorism have claimed over 900,000 lives, with some 335,000 of them civilians, injured millions, and displaced tens of millions. The 2003 Iraq War resulted in some 200,000 to 250,000 civilian deaths, including over 16,000 directly killed by the U.S. military, and left more than 1 million homeless. The U.S. has created 37 million refugees around the world. Since 2012, the number of Syrian refugees alone has increased tenfold. Between 2016 and 2019, 33,584 civilian deaths were documented in the Syrian fighting, including 3,833 killed by the U.S.-led coalition bombings, half of them women and children. The Public Broadcasting Service reported on November 9, 2018, that the airstrikes launched by U.S. forces on Raqqa alone killed 1,600 Syrian civilians. The 2-decade-long war in Afghanistan devastated the country, A total of 47,000 Afghan civilians and 66,000 to 69,000 Afghan soldiers and police officers unrelated to the September 11 attacks were killed in U.S. military operations, and more than 10 million people were displaced. The war in Afghanistan destroyed the foundation of economic development there and plunged the Afghan people into destitution. After the Kabul debacle in 2021, the U.S. announced that it would freeze some $9.5 billion in assets belonging to the Afghan Central Bank, a move considered pure looting. In September 2022, Turkish Interior Minister Süleyman Soylu commented at a rally that the U.S. has waged a proxy war in Syria, turned Afghanistan into an opium field and heroin factory, thrown Pakistan into turmoil, and left Libya in incessant civil unrest. The U.S. does whatever it takes to rob and enslave the people of any country with underground resources. The U.S. has also adopted appalling methods in war during the Korean War, the Vietnam War, the Gulf War, the Kosovo War, the war in Afghanistan, and the Iraq War. The United States used massive quantities of chemical and biological weapons as well as cluster bombs, fuel air bombs, graphite bombs, and depleted uranium bombs, causing enormous damage on civilian facilities, countless civilian casualties, and lasting environmental pollution. Economic hegemony, looting, and exploitation. After World War II, the U.S. led efforts to set up the Bretton Woods system, the International Monetary Fund, and the World Bank, which together with the Marshall Plan formed the international monetary system centered around the U.S. dollar. In addition, the U.S. has established institutional hegemony in the international economic and financial sector by manipulating the weighted voting systems, rules, the arrangements of international organizations, including approval by 85% majority, and its domestic trade laws and regulations. By taking advantage of the dollar status as the major international reserve currency, the U.S. is basically collecting seigniorage from around the world and using its control over international organizations.
Seigniorage.
Profit made by a government by issuing currency, especially the difference between the face value of coins and their production costs. Interesting. It coerces other countries into serving America's political and economic strategy. The U.S. exploits the world's wealth with the help of its seigniorage. It costs only about 17 cents to produce a $100 bill, but other countries had to pony up $100 worth of actual goods in order to obtain one. It was pointed out more than half a century ago that the U.S. enjoyed exorbitant privilege and deficit without tears created by its dollar, or tears created by its dollar, and used the worthless paper note to plunder the resources and factories of other nations. The hegemony of the U.S. dollar is the main source of instability and uncertainty in the world economy. During the COVID-19 pandemic, the U.S. abused its global financial hegemony and injected trillions of dollars into the global market, leaving other countries, especially emerging economies, to pay the price. In 2022, the Fed ended its ultra-easy monetary policy and turned to its aggressive interest rate hikes, causing turmoil in the international financial market and substantial depreciation of other currencies such as the euro, many of which dropped to a 20-year low. As a result, a large number of developing countries were challenged by high inflation, currency depreciation, and capital outflows. This was exactly what Nixon's Secretary of the Treasury, John Connally, once remarked with self-satisfaction yet sharp precision: "The dollar is our currency, but it's your problem." With its control over international economic and financial organizations, the U.S. imposes additional conditions for assisting other countries. In order to reduce obstacles to U.S. capital inflow and speculation, the recipient countries are required to advance financial liberalization and open up financial markets so that their economic policies would fall in line with America's strategy. According to the Review of International Political Economy, along with the 1,550 debt relief programs extended by the IMF to its 131 member countries from 1985 to 2014, as many as 55,465 additional political conditions had been attached. The U.S. willfully suppresses its opponents with economic coercion in the 1980s to eliminate the economic threat posed by Japan in control, and used the latter in service of America's strategic goal of confronting the Soviet Union and dominating the world. The U.S. leveraged its hegemonic financial power against Japan and concluded the Plaza Accord. As a result, the yen was pushed up and Japan was pressed to open its financial market and reform its financial system. The Plaza Accord dealt a heavy blow to the growth momentum of the Japanese economy, leaving Japan to what was later called 3 lost decades. America's economic and financial hegemony has become a geopolitical weapon, doubling down on unilateral sanctions and long-arm jurisdiction. The U.S. has enacted such domestic laws as the International Emergency Economies Powers Act and the Global Magnitsky Human Rights Accountability Act and the Countering America's Adversaries Through Sanctions Act, and introduced a series of executive orders to sanction specific countries, organizations, or individuals. Statistics show that the U.S. sanctions against foreign entities increased by 933% from 2000 to 2021. The Trump administration alone has imposed more than 3,900 sanctions, which means 3 sanctions per day. So far, the United States had or has imposed economic sanctions on nearly 40 countries across the world, including Cuba, China, Russia, the DPRK, Iran, Venezuela, affecting nearly half of the world's populations. The U.S. of America has turned itself into the U.S. of sanctions, and long-arm jurisdiction has been reduced to nothing but a tool for the U.S. to use its means of state power to suppress economic competitors and interfere in normal international business. This is a series of departure from the principles of liberal market economy that the U.S. has long boasted. Technological hegemony, monopoly, and suppression. The U.S. seeks to deter other countries' scientific, technological, and economic development by wielding monopoly power, suppression measures, and technology restrictions in high-tech fields. The U.S. monopolizes intellectual property in the name of protection, taking advantage of the weak position of other countries, especially developing ones, on intellectual property rights and the institutional vacancy in relevant fields. The U.S. reaped successive profits through monopoly. In 1994, the United States pushed forward the Agreement on Trade-Related Aspects of Intellectual Property Rights, forcing the Americanized process and standards in intellectual property protection in an attempt to solidify its monopoly on technology. In the 80s, to contain the development of Japan's semiconductor industry, the U.S. states launched the 301 investigation, built bargaining power and bilateral negotiations through multilateral agreements, threatened to label Japan as conducting unfair trade and impose retaliatory tariffs, forcing Japan to sign the U.S.-Japan Semiconductor Agreement. As a result, Japanese semiconductor enterprises were almost completely driven out of global competition, and their market share dropped from 50% to 10%. Meanwhile, with the support of the U.S. government, a large number of U.S. semiconductor enterprises took the opportunity and grabbed a larger market share. The U.S. politicizes and weaponizes technological issues and uses them as ideological tools. Overstretching the concept of national security, the U.S. mobilized state power to suppress and sanction Chinese company Huawei, restricted the entry of Huawei products into the U.S. market, cut off its supply of chips and operating systems, and coerced other countries to ban Huawei from undertaking local 5G network construction. It even talked Canada into unwarrantedly detaining Huawei CFO Meng Wanzhou for nearly 3 years. The U.S. has fabricated a slew of excuses to clamp down on China's high-tech enterprises with global competitiveness and has put more than 1,000 Chinese enterprises on sanction lists. In addition, the U.S. has also imposed controls on biotechnology, artificial intelligence, and other high-end technologies, reinforced export restrictions, tightened investment screening, suppressed Chinese social media apps such as TikTok and WeChat, and lobbied the Netherlands and Japan to restrict exports of chips and related equipment or technology to China. The U.S. has also practiced double standards in policy on China-related technological professionals to sideline and suppress Chinese researchers. Since June 2018, visa validity has been shortened for Chinese students majoring in certain high-tech-related disciplines. Repeated cases have occurred where Chinese scholars and students go to the U.S. for exchange programs and study were unjustifiably denied, harassed, and large-scale investigation on Chinese scholars working in the U.S. was carried out. The U.S. solidifies its technological monopoly by the name of protecting democracy by building small blocks of technology such as the CHIPS Alliance and Clean Network. The U.S. has put democracy and human rights labels on high technology and turned technological issues into political and ideological issues to fabricate excuses for its technological blockade against the other countries. In May 2019, the U.S. enlisted 32 countries to the Prague 5G Security Conference in the Czech Republic and issued the Prague Proposal in an attempt to exclude China's 5G products. In April 22, then U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo announced the 5G Clean Path, a plan designed to build a technological alliance in the 5G field with partners bonded by their shared ideology on democracy and the need to protect cybersecurity. The measures, in essence, are the U.S. attempts to maintain its technological hegemony through technological alliances. The U.S. abuses its technological hegemony by carrying out cyber attacks and eavesdropping. The U.S. has long been notorious as an empire of hackers blamed for its rampant acts of cyber theft around the world. It has all kinds of means to enforce pervasive cyber attacks on surveillance, including using analog-based station signals to access mobile phones for data theft, manipulating mobile apps, infiltrating cloud servers, and stealing through undersea cables. The list goes on. U.S. surveillance is indiscriminate. All can be targets of its surveillance, be they rivals, allies, even leaders of allied countries such as former German Chancellor Angela Merkel and several French presidents. Cyber surveillance and attacks launched by the U.S. such as PRISM, Dirtbox, Irritant Horn, and Telescreen Operation are all proof that U.S. is closely monitoring its allies and partners. Such eavesdropping on allies and partners has already caused worldwide outrage. Julian Assange, the founder of WikiLeaks, a website that's exposed U.S. surveillance programs, said, "Do not expect a global surveillance superpower to act with honor or respect. There's only one rule. There are no rules." Cultural hegemony, spreading false narratives. The global expansion of American culture is an important part of its external strategy. The U.S. has often used cultural tools to strengthen and maintain its hegemony in the world. The U.S. embeds American values in its products, such as movies. American values and lifestyle are tied to its movies, TV shows, publications, media, content, programs, government-funded nonprofit cultural institutions. It thus shapes a cultural and public opinion space in which American culture reigns and maintains cultural hegemony. In his article, The Americanization of the World, John Yema, an American scholar, exposed the real weapons in U.S. cultural expansion: Hollywood, the image design factories on Madison Avenue, and the production lines of Mattel Company and Coca-Cola. These are various vehicles the U.S. uses to keep its cultural hegemony. American movies are the most used. They now occupy more than 70% of the world's market share. The U.S. skillfully exploits its cultural diversity to appeal to various ethnicities. When Hollywood movies descend on the world, they scream the American values tied to them. American cultural hegemony not only shows itself in direct intervention, but also in media infiltration, and as a trumpet for the world. U.S.-dominated Western media has a particularly important role in shaping global public opinion in favor of U.S. meddling in the internal affairs of other countries. The U.S. government strictly censors all social media companies and demands their obedience. Twitter CEO Elon Musk admitted on December 27, 2022, that all social media platforms work with the U.S. government to censor content, reported Fox Business Network. Public opinion in the U.S. is subject to government intervention to restrict all unfavorable remarks. Google often makes pages disappear. The U.S. Departments of Defense manipulates social media. In December 2022, The Intercept, an independent U.S. investigative website, revealed that in July 2017, U.S. Central Command Officer Nathaniel Collar instructed Twitter's public policy team to augment the presence of 52 Arab language accounts on a list he sent, 6 of which were to be given priority. One of the 6 was dedicated to justifying U.S. drone attacks in Yemen, such as by claiming that the attacks were precise and killed only terrorists, not civilians. Following Collar's directive, Twitter put those Arabic language accounts on a whitelist to amplify certain messages. The U.S. practices double standards on the freedom of the press. It brutally suppresses and silences the media of other countries by various means. The U.S. states and Europe bar mainstream Russian media such as Russia Today and Sputnik from their countries. Platforms such as Twitter, Facebook, and YouTube openly restrict official accounts of Russia. Netflix, Apple, and Google have removed Russian channels and applications from their services and app stores. Unprecedented draconian censorship is imposed on Russian-related content. The U.S. abuses its its cultural hegemony to instigate peaceful evolution in socialist countries. It sets up news media and cultural outfits targeting socialist countries. It pours staggering amounts of public funds into radio and TV networks to support their ideological infiltration. And these mouthpieces bombard socialist countries in dozens of languages with inflammatory propaganda day and night. The U.S. uses misinformation as a spear to attack other countries and has built an industrial chain around it. There are groups and individuals making up stories and peddling them worldwide to mislead public opinion with the support of nearly limitless financial resources. While a just cause wins its champion-wide support, an unjust one condemns its pursuer to be an outcast. The hegemonic, domineering, and bullying practices of using strength to intimidate the weak, taking from others by force and subterfuge, and playing zero-sum games are exerting grave harm. The historical trends of peace, development, cooperation, and mutual benefit are unstoppable. The U.S. has been overriding truth with its power and trampling justice to serve self-interest. these unilateral, egoistic, and regressive hegemonic practices have drawn growing, intense criticism and opposition from the international community. Countries need to respect each other and treat each other as equals. Big countries should behave in a manner befitting their status and take the lead in pursuing a new model of state-to-state relations featuring dialogue and partnership, not confrontation or alliance. China opposes all forms of hegemonism and power politics and rejects interference in other countries' internal affairs. The U.S. must conduct serious soul-searching. It must critically examine what's done and let go of its arrogance and prejudice and quit its hegemonic, domineering, and bullying practices. And here is a take on it from the Duran. China and Russia align to challenge collective West.
Alexander, let's talk about these documents, position papers that the Chinese Foreign Ministry has published. We have the Global Security Initiative concept paper, and then kind of underneath that you have another paper with the title U.S. Hegemony and Its Perils. Makes for an interesting read. What's your take on these papers?
Well, they're an extraordinary read. I mean, the Chinese, the global security concept paper, I think we can, to some extent, disregard because it flows from the other. What the Chinese are doing is they're now accepting that they're in an adversarial relationship with the United States. I mean, this is now, it seems to me, a formal statement from China. These papers are a formal statement from China that there are now two poles in the world again. There's the American and there's the Chinese. The Chinese say the Americans conduct foreign policy this way. The Chinese say we conduct foreign policy in a different way. And that's what the concept paper is all about. The more interesting one and the easier one to read and the more, shall we say, colourful and vivid one is the one in which they discuss US hegemony. And I have to say it's astonishing. I mean, it is an absolute attack, a frontal assault on US foreign policy and the way it's conducted. Now, straight away, I have to say I agree with, most of us here on the Duran would agree with an awful lot of what's there. I mean, they say straight away that the United States disregards international law. It's very critical of this concept of the rules-based international order. It says that this is an attempt to demolish international law. It says that the US instigates wars. It interferes in the internal affairs of other countries. It doesn't accept that other countries have a right to develop in their own way. It tries to remodel their political systems. It engages in color revolutions, and it gives a whole list of countries where there have been color revolutions. It says that the United States is extremely warlike. It calls the United States the most warlike of all countries. It catalogues various US military interventions. It also talks about US economic abuse, if you like, the abuse the United States makes of its economic position, its manipulation of the dollar system to its own advantage. It talks about the US looting most of the world, for its own benefit. It talks about how the United States tries to prevent other countries' technological development. It gives an example of Japan in the 1980s. It says that the United States is trying to do the same thing to China as well. And in some ways, for me, the most interesting section, I say interesting because it's new coming from the Chinese, is that there's a whole section about how the United States is trying to spread its own value system through culture, through media, through social media, through films, and the way that this is immensely disruptive of values and traditions in other countries, and is ultimately corrupting to those systems. So it's an extraordinary paper, actually. But let's take a step back, because we've heard all of this from someone else, and the person we've heard it from is Vladimir Putin. I mean, if you think about this, this is very, very similar to the critique that Vladimir Putin, I wouldn't say similar, I'd say it's identical to the critique that Vladimir Putin has been making of US policy now for several years. He even attended, if you remember, a Davos, a session at Davos about 2 years ago. And in front of people like Klaus Schwab, he made all these kind of attacks. He's talked about unipolarity, the US quest for hegemony. He's been doing that ever since the 2007 Munich Security Conference, where he delivered that famous speech with Senator McCain fuming in the front row. So what we now see is that the Chinese have wholesale accepted the Russian critique of US foreign policy, of the globalist foreign policy as well, because that also plays a part of that, but they particularly focus it on the United States. So what we now have, and it's very straightforward, is a complete conceptual, even ideological convergence between the Chinese and the Russians about foreign policy. The Chinese are now saying we're against American exceptionalism, against what the neocons are doing, and though the Chinese still sometimes pretend that they are supporters of globalization, it's difficult to read this position paper and not feel that they've accepted again the Russian view that globalization is a bad thing. The kind of globalization that Klaus Schwab and some people in the West have been promoting from a Chinese point of view and a Russian point of view is now a bad thing. So we now have the Chinese converging with the Russians as they decide that from their point of view, the United States is an adversary. It's almost, if you like, the enemy, and they're part now of this partnership with the Russians pushing back against all of these things.
Okay, so the Chinese, obviously, they understand that if things go badly for Russia with this conflict in Ukraine, and Russia's eventually, let's say, balkanized by Newland and Sullivan, Blinken, Biden, the plan to get regime change in Russia and balkanize Russia with the defeat in Ukraine. The Chinese understand that they're next. So that's one way to explain this paper. But another way to look at this paper is to look at the Chinese as saying, Russia is winning, and the 80% of the global South has not moved away from Russia's position in this conflict with the collective West. And so the time is right for us now, as China, as the big partner in this new system that's being set up. Now is the time for us to assert ourselves and say, here we are. We're here. This is our position. This is what we offer the world. Who wants to try out this new way of doing things? I guess the question to you is, China would not be coming out with this paper if they didn't understand that things are going very well, not only for Russia, but in the war, not only for Russia in the war, but also in terms of the sanctions, of the economic war, of moving away from the U.S. dollar, in energy. I mean, I think they feel comfortable with the situation, yes, so that they can now come out and say, here we are, and we're the leader of this new system, or we're going to take the lead in this new system.
Exactly. And this is exactly what it is. Now, can I just say, first of all, let's talk about the first point about Ukraine. Let's specifically talk about Ukraine, which is not really, this is a much bigger thing than just Ukraine. But Wang Yi, who is now in overall charge of Chinese foreign policy, is in Moscow. He's had a whole succession of meetings. He's met Patrushev, who's the head of the Security Council, very powerful man, Putin's national security advisor, the man who's also in overall charge of the Russian intelligence community. He had a very, very big session with Lavrov, and he's also met Putin himself. And we know that part of the purpose of his visit to Moscow is to prepare the ground for Xi Jinping's visit to Moscow, which is now expected at some point next month. So Xi Jinping is heading to Moscow. Now, over the course of all of these meetings, there was a discussion between Lavrov and Wang Yi. And we've only got one readout so far. It's very sketchy, and it comes from the Russian Foreign Ministry. But it said that the Chinese and the Russians agree about what was the root cause of the Ukrainian conflict. So that means, if we follow it through, that the Chinese also agree with the Russians about what caused the Ukrainian conflict, because the Russians have set it out in enormous amounts of detail. Now, given that that is so, and given that, as you absolutely rightly say, the Chinese understand that this is a neocon project, and that the neocons, if they manage to succeed in Ukraine, would move on to come after China once they've broken up, fragmented, pulped Russia, impose their own kind of system on Russia. The Chinese are not going to let that happen. And I think this is the thing people now need to understand. If the US goes on escalating in Ukraine, the Chinese, for the moment, want to keep their distance. They don't want to be seen visibly sending arms to Ukraine. But if they go on escalating to the point where it really looks as if the Russians might get into trouble, the Chinese will step in. And they will not allow Russia to be defeated in Ukraine, because it has now become a matter of vital strategic interest to the Chinese that the Russians don't lose. Now, that's an important point to understand, but it's come out clearly both from Wang Yi's visit and from what is contained in all of these position papers. So that's the first thing to say. But the second thing, and it's the second point that we were making, is actually the more important one. Because why have the Chinese come out with all these things now? They've come out with all of these things now for exactly the reason that you say. They feel they can, because the drift of world opinion is in their favor. It's moving towards these positions, which Putin very courageously outlined years ago, but they're obviously now gaining increasing traction around the world. We're seeing this currently at the current UN General Assembly session, where it seems the West is having great trouble putting together a resolution, a General Assembly resolution, critical of Russia over Ukraine. What we're hearing is that it's been basically stripped of all substance. But even that is apparently having problems getting traction there. So the Chinese see that. They see that global opinion is turning against the US, that the Saudis are drifting away from the US, that the Brazilians refuse to get involved in the war in Ukraine, that Mexico is speaking out, that the African leaders are siding with the Russians, that everybody seems to be increasingly exasperated with the neocons and with the Americans and with the EU, which is, of course, the neocons' willing accomplice. And the Chinese are saying, this is our moment. We are far and away the most powerful country. that is rivaling the US. This is our moment. This is the moment when we can come out, say to the world straightforwardly, this is what America, the neocons in America, how they conduct foreign policy. And we are your champion. We will stand with you all around the world as you resist it. And we've come up with our alternative foreign policy, our alternative vision of the world, which is all, of course, about cooperation and friendship and respecting international law and respecting the rights of countries to choose their own destinies, and is opposed to interference in internal affairs and all of those things. So you see that the Chinese sense that this is their moment and they're seizing it.
Yeah, this is the real war. I mean, what's happening in Ukraine is, to me, is a battle in this larger war, which is the movement from a unipolar, neoliberal, globalist world order to something else, or at least having the option to have something else. Doesn't mean the one goes away, but at least now you're going to have a different system that other countries, specifically countries in the global south, maybe even NATO members like Turkey, maybe even EU members like Hungary, they can look at this alternative system and they can say, this is interesting. Maybe I'll look further into the way they're doing things and look into their organizations and the way they provide financing, or the way they can help out on an economic level or on a trade level or even on a military level. So I mean, it does provide a new alternate system for a lot of the countries in the world that up until today were stuck with just one player, and that was this neoliberal globalist thing. And so that
and from IPPmedia.com, China urges U.S. to abandon hegemony and bullying. A Chinese foreign ministry spokesperson Friday said that U.S. is not accustomed to hearing the truth, is still less willing to force the problems. Spokesperson Wang Wenbin made the remarks in response to U.S. Ambassador to China Nicholas Burns' tweet regarding a U.S.-related report released by the Chinese side. Wang said the report is nothing but telling the truth and objectively presenting the U.S. hegemonic and bullying behavior to the world. Noting power and coercive diplomacy, the spokesperson said it's nothing like a powerful country's demeanor and suggested an American ambassador should report the true voice to Washington. The U.S. should refrain from seeking hegemony or bullying, respect other countries' sovereignty and territorial integrity, and seek a path of peaceful coexistence and win-win results. Okay, and at this point, I'm going to open a channel. And I'll see you tomorrow.
Beam me up, Mr. Spark. Beam me up. Lock on transporters. Beam us up. Beam us up. Quickly. Beam us up home. Beam us up.
Prepare to beam us up, Mr. Scott. Beam us up, Mr. Scott.
Prepare to beam us up. Mr. Scott, prepare to beam us up. Have Scotty beam us up. Beam us up. Beam us up. Scotty, beam us up fast.
Stand by to beam us up.
Scotty, beam me up.
Beam me up.
Beam us up now!
Stand by to beam us up.
No need to beam me up, sir. The situation is under control.